Every Sherman commander in the Third Army knew the secret. Add 12 inches of concrete to your hull, and you might make it home. Get caught by Patton, and you'd be scraping it off with your bare hands. Most chose the concrete. Here's what they were up against. The M4 Sherman rolled off Detroit assembly lines with 75 millimeters of frontal armor, sloped at 47 degrees. The engineers at Chrysler thought that was enough. They'd never seen an 88. The German 88mm KWK 36L56 mounted on a Tiger could punch through 138 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 2,000 meters. At 1,000 meters, it went through 155 millimeters. The Sherman's effective armor thickness after calculating the slope? 91 millimeters. You didn't need a slide rule to figure out you were dead. But it wasn't just the Tiger's main gun that killed Shermans. By late 1944, every German infantryman from here to Berlin carried a Panzerfaust, a disposable anti-tank weapon that cost 20 Reichsmarks to produce and could turn a 30-ton tank into a crematorium. The Panzerfaust worked on shaped charge principles. A copper cone backed by explosive. When detonated, the cone inverts and becomes a jet of molten metal, traveling at 8,000 meters per second. Temperature, 500 degrees Celsius. Pressure, 300,000 atmospheres. It doesn't push through armor. It liquefies it. Sherman crews called their tanks Ronsons after the cigarette lighter. The company's slogan was, "Lights the first time, every time." So did the Sherman. The ammunition was stored in sponsons along the hull sides. One penetration, and the propellant charges cooked off in sequence. The crew had 17 seconds to get out. If the hatch wasn't jammed. If they weren't already unconscious from the overpressure. If their clothes weren't on fire. The British came up with a solution. They called it the Firefly. Same Sherman chassis, but with a 17-pounder gun that could actually threaten a Tiger. The Americans had a different solution. They'd send 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger. The tactical manuals were very clear about this. 1 Sherman would die getting the Tiger's attention. 2 more would die during the flanking maneuver. The last 2 would get around the sides, where the armor was only 60 millimeters thick. 3 dead crews for 1 dead Tiger. That was doctrine. By December 1944, the Third Army's 4th Armored Division was losing a tank for every mile gained. The replacement crews coming from Fort Knox were younger, 18, 19 years old. They'd been trained on the new M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun and proper armor. But there were only 20 Pershings in the entire European theater. So they got Shermans, and they got creative. The first modifications appeared in Normandy. Tank crews started welding pieces of German beach obstacles to their hulls. Hedgerow cutters made from scrap steel. Then came the sandbags. Hundreds of them, stacked and tied around the turret and hull. The weight was crushing the forward bogies. But crews didn't care. Anything was better than naked steel. Then someone discovered concrete. Not the engineers, not the ordnance department. A sergeant from the 14th Armored Division who'd worked construction in Chicago before the war. He looked at a destroyed German pillbox and had an idea. If concrete could stop artillery shells, maybe it could stop a Panzerfaust. The word spread through the tank parks like coordinates for a brothel. Crews started welding steel frames to their hulls. Rebar cages, ammunition boxes, anything that could hold concrete. They'd roll up to destroyed buildings, find a cement mixer, add water from their radiators, and pour it straight onto their tanks. 24 hours to cure, 2 tons of extra weight, transmissions screaming in protest. It was ugly. It was unmilitary. It violated every regulation in the Armor Field Manual. And then Patton saw it. December 15th, 1944. Outside Bastogne. General George S. Patton's command car stops beside a line of Shermans from the 4th Armored. He's there to inspect the spearhead of his relief force. What he sees makes his face turn the color of raw beef. Every single tank is covered in concrete. Patton didn't say a word at first. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman, later wrote that the general walked the entire line, his cavalry boots squelching in the frozen mud, examining each tank like a drill sergeant inspecting bunks. The concrete was everywhere. Turrets, hulls, even over the driver's hatches. One crew had embedded German helmets in the concrete for extra steel. Then Patton exploded. The words that came out of his mouth aren't recorded in any official history, but every tanker in the 4th Armored heard them. Patton grabbed a pickaxe from a maintenance truck and started attacking the concrete himself, chips flying, cursing with each swing. He ordered every crew out of their tanks, made them watch as he destroyed what had taken them days to build. His reasoning was pure Patton. Speed is armor. Mobility kills. A moving tank is a living tank. Every pound of concrete was a second lost in acceleration. Every sandbag was a mile less of operational range. The Sherman was designed to be fast, agile, to flank and maneuver, not to sit there and trade shots like some medieval knight. He had the numbers to back it up. A clean Sherman could hit 28 miles per hour on a road. With concrete, they were lucky to manage 18. The vertical volute spring suspension was already overloaded with the base armor. Add 2 tons of concrete, and the bogies would collapse after 50 miles. The Ford GAA engine generated 500 horsepower, but the transmission was designed for a 30-ton vehicle. These concrete monsters weighed nearly 40 tons. Patton issued General Order 31 that night. Any tank commander found with unauthorized modifications would face court-martial. Any maintenance chief caught helping them would be reduced in rank. The order was to be read aloud at every morning briefing. But here's what Patton didn't understand. Or maybe he did and didn't care. His entire tactical philosophy was built on attacking, always attacking. Hit them where they're not. Hit them before they know you're coming. The Third Army's nickname was Flash Lucky Forward, because Patton moved his headquarters so close to the front. The tank crews weren't attacking anymore. They were defending, holding crossroads, sitting in hold-down positions while German infantry crept through the rubble with Panzerfausts. In those situations, speed meant nothing. You can't outrun a weapon that's fired from a basement window 15 meters away. Patton's own after-action reports showed the reality. 70% of Sherman losses came from ambushes, static positions, urban combat, situations where the tank was already stopped when it died. Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, a man who'd later have a tank named after him. He listened to Patton's order, nodded respectfully, and then told his crews to keep the concrete. Just be smart about it. Inspections happened at dawn, so they'd scrape the concrete off at night, pass inspection, then put it back on before rolling out. Abrams wasn't the only commander playing this game. The 6th Armored developed a quick release system. Concrete blocks, held on with wire, that could be cut in seconds. The 11th Armored painted their concrete olive drab and claimed it was "plow spare armor plates flash" on the requisition forms. The maintenance sergeants were the real heroes. They'd report transmission failures that didn't exist, claim they needed to strip the tank down for repairs, then spend the day helping crews rebuild their concrete shells. They kept duplicate maintenance logs, one for Patton's inspectors showing clean tanks, another showing the real modifications. There was a black market for Portland cement. Crews would trade cigarettes, chocolate, even ammunition for bags of concrete mix. The engineers complained their bridge-building supplies kept disappearing. Nobody asked questions. Everyone knew where it went. The infantry loved the concrete Shermans, not because they were prettier, but because the tank crews with concrete fought differently. They'd actually stick around during an assault instead of pulling back at the first sign of a Panzerfaust team. A Sherman with concrete would park in front of a building and slug it out. A clean Sherman would reverse the moment they heard German voices. Patton's headquarters kept meticulous records of the court-martials. Between December 1944 and February 1945, not a single tank commander was prosecuted for unauthorized modifications. The paperwork would mysteriously disappear. Witnesses couldn't be found. Photographic evidence got lost. The general knew what was happening. He had to. Patton's intelligence network was too good to miss thousands of tons of concrete being poured onto his tanks every night. But prosecuting every tank commander in the Third Army would mean admitting his order was being ignored. So the dance continued. Patton would show up for inspections, find clean tanks, and leave satisfied. An hour later, the same tanks would be covered in concrete again. The crews got faster at it. What took days in December took hours by January. They'd develop techniques. Forms made from ammunition boxes. Quick-setting mixtures using sugar and salt. Some crews could add a full concrete shell in 3 hours. Then came February 3rd, 1945. The day everything changed. The day concrete saved the crew of a Sherman named Thunderbolt. And the day Patton's order met reality in the streets of Cologne. Here's how you armor a Sherman tank with concrete without getting caught by George Patton. First, you need steel, not armor plate. That's impossible to get. You need mild steel, construction grade, about 1/4 inch thick. The destroyed railroad yards were perfect. Crews would cut sections of track with acetylene torches, still warm from Allied bombing runs. Railroad track steel has a carbon content of 0.7%. Strong enough to hold concrete, soft enough to weld. The welding was the dangerous part. Not because of the Germans, because of the sound. An arc welder throws light that can be seen for miles and makes a buzzing that carries through tank parks. So, crews learned to weld during artillery barrages. When the 155s opened up, that was welding time. The thunder covered the spark. They'd create a cage offset from the main armor by 4 to 6 inches. This gap was critical. It's called standoff distance in the ordnance manuals. The more space between the detonation point and the main armor, the more the molten jet disperses. 4 inches of air could reduce penetration by 30%. The cage wasn't uniform. Thicker sections over the ammunition sponsons, thinner over the driver's hatch so he could still escape. The transmission housing got double layers because a mobility kill meant death. Every crew had different theories about the optimal pattern. Some built rectangular grids. Others used diamond patterns copied from German Zimmerit anti-magnetic coating. Now, for the concrete itself. Standard military concrete uses a 1-2-3 mix ratio. 1 part cement, 2 parts sand, 3 parts aggregate. But tank crews couldn't be picky about materials. They'd use whatever they could find. Crushed brick from destroyed buildings, gravel from riverbeds, sand from sandbags taken off infantry positions. The cement was the bottleneck. Pre-war construction sites were picked clean by January 1945. So, crews got creative. They discovered that crushed limestone from French quarries could substitute for Portland cement if you added enough water. The concrete was weaker, only 2,000 psi instead of 3,000, but it would still disrupt a shape charge. The mixing happened in German helmets, 20 helmets of dry mix per tank side. Water came from the cooling systems of destroyed vehicles. Radiator fluid mixed with concrete created a slight green tinge that crews called plush Patton Green. The glycol in the coolant actually improved the concrete's cold weather curing. Colonel Abrams's tank, Thunderbolt, became the prototype for advanced modifications. His crew chief, Sergeant Early, had been a construction foreman in Pennsylvania. He didn't just add concrete randomly. He calculated load distributions. The human body can mix about 40 pounds of concrete by hand before exhaustion. A full armor job required 4,000 pounds. That's 100 batches. 5 men working in shifts could do it in 6 hours. But they had to work in the dark, by touch, feeling for voids in the concrete that could create weak spots. The aggregate mattered more than anyone realized at first. Sharp, angular aggregate, like crushed stone, creates better mechanical interlock. Smooth river gravel leaves weak planes where the concrete can shear. Sergeant Early added barbed wire to his mix. The wire wouldn't stop a projectile, but it held the concrete together after impact, preventing spalling. Here's where the physics gets interesting. A Panzerfaust warhead detonates on contact. The copper cone inside inverts into a jet through explosive compression. This jet has a specific length and energy. Concrete doesn't stop the jet. It makes it waste itself. When the jet hits concrete, it begins excavating a crater. The process is called hydrodynamic penetration because the pressures are so high that both the jet and the target behave like liquids. Every inch of concrete the jet travels through degrades its penetration capability. The jet breaks up, tumbles, and disperses its energy into a wider cone. 4 inches of concrete could reduce a Panzerfaust's penetration from 200 millimeters to 140 millimeters, still enough to penetrate a Sherman's base armor in theory. But concrete doesn't fail cleanly. It shatters, shifts, and absorbs energy through fragmentation. The actual penetration reduction was closer to 50%. The crews discovered this through experimentation. They'd take captured Panzerfausts and test them on destroyed tanks with various concrete configurations. They found that layered concrete with air gaps worked better than solid blocks. They learned that wet concrete, even partially cured, performed better than fully dried concrete because it absorbed more energy through plastic deformation. Some crews added special ingredients: scrap metal embedded in the concrete, ball bearings from destroyed vehicles. One enterprising sergeant added glass bottles filled with gasoline, theorizing they'd create a fireball that would disrupt the jet. It didn't work, but he kept trying. The application technique evolved rapidly. Early attempts used wooden forms that took days to set up. By February, crews were using cardboard from ration boxes soaked in motor oil. The oil prevented the concrete from sticking, and the cardboard could be burned off after curing. Thermite grenades became curing tools. The concrete needed heat to set properly in winter. Crews would place thermite grenades near the concrete, pull the pins, and let the 2,500 degrees Celsius heat accelerate the chemical reaction. They had to be careful. Too close, and the concrete would crack from thermal shock. Too far, and it wouldn't cure at all. The final innovation was camouflage. Concrete is gray. Shermans are olive drab. The contrast made them obvious targets and inspection failures. Crews learned to add lamp black from burned diesel to darken the concrete. They'd press leaves and branches into the wet surface to create texture. From 50 feet away, you couldn't tell the difference between concrete and factory armor. Thunderbolt ended up carrying 4,200 pounds of concrete by February 1945. The transmission was rebuilt 3 times. The suspension was reinforced with springs from a destroyed Panther. The driver could barely see through a vision slit, narrowed by concrete. But when Sergeant Early tested it with a captured Panzerfaust, the warhead detonated harmlessly in the concrete, leaving a crater 18 inches wide, but only 6 inches deep. The main armor underneath showed nothing but scorch marks. Word spread through the Third Army like coordinates for a supply dump. Every crew wanted the Thunderbolt recipe. Early found himself giving midnight classes on concrete application. He drew diagrams on the backs of maps, calculated mixing ratios on ammunition boxes. Then came the real test. Not on a range with captured weapons, but in the streets of Cologne, where German paratroopers waited in every rubble pile with Panzerfausts, where Thunderbolt would prove whether concrete could really stop the weapon that had killed so many Shermans. The date was February 26, 1945. The place was the Cologne Cathedral Square. And what happened there would force even Patton to reconsider his ban on concrete armor. February 26, 1945. So 9:47 hours, Cologne Cathedral Square. Thunderbolt rolled down Hohe Strasse at walking speed, 2 miles per hour. Any faster and the driver couldn't navigate the rubble. The concrete had reduced his vision to a horizontal slit, 4 inches wide. He steered by looking at where the walls weren't. Colonel Abrams was buttoned up in the turret. The concrete around the commander's hatch was sculpted into a slope deflector that Sergeant Early had designed. It pushed blast pressure away from the hatch seals. The radio aerial had been relocated 3 times because the concrete kept snapping it off. The infantry was supposed to be clearing buildings ahead of them. 6 men from the 104th Infantry Division. But infantry has a different definition of clear slars than tankers. Clear meant no machine guns. It didn't mean checking every basement window for a 17-year-old Fallschirmjäger with a Panzerfaust. The cathedral loomed on their left, 700 years old, somehow still standing while everything around it had been reduced to brick dust. The twin spires threw shadows across the square. In those shadows, German paratroopers waited. Thunderbolt's gunner, Corporal William McVeigh, traversed the turret left. The concrete added so much weight that the hydraulic traverse motor had burned out near Duren. They were hand-cranking now, 40 turns of the wheel to rotate the turret 90 degrees. McVeigh's shoulders burned from the effort. The loader, Private Melvin Miller, had 5 rounds in the ready rack, 3 high-explosive, 2 armor-piercing. The concrete had shifted the tank's center of gravity so much that reaching the ammunition sponsons while moving was impossible. You'd fall face first into the breach. The bow gunner couldn't see anything. His position was covered entirely in concrete, except for a tiny firing port. He'd given up trying to aim and just pointed the .30 caliber in the general direction of Germany and held the trigger down whenever they stopped. 9:51 hours. The first sign of trouble was a window shutter moving, 3rd floor of a bombed-out department store. Shutters don't move in abandoned buildings unless someone moves them. Abrams called it out, but the turret was already traversing. Too slow. 40 turns of the hand crank. The shutter opened fully. A dark tube appeared, the distinctive bulbous nose of a Panzerfaust 60. Effective range, 60 meters. Distance to Thunderbolt, 35 meters. The German fired first. A Panzerfaust launch is distinctive. First comes the crack of the propellant charge. Then, a half-second of silence as the warhead flies. Then impact. The warhead hit Thunderbolt's turret at the joint between the concrete and the turret ring. Perfect shot placement. The jet should have penetrated the turret race, killed the crew, and detonated the ammunition. Instead, this happened. The detonation crushed Sergeant Early's carefully calculated concrete matrix. The aggregate shattered into 1,000-degree fragments. The Portland cement vaporized. The barbed wire reinforcement turned molten. The copper jet, designed to penetrate 200 millimeters of homogeneous armor, spent its energy excavating concrete. Inside Thunderbolt, the crew felt the impact as a sledgehammer blow that rang through the hull like a cathedral bell. Concrete dust filled the fighting compartment. The temperature spiked 20 degrees in an instant. McVeigh's ears rang so badly he couldn't hear Abrams screaming coordinates. But they were alive. The jet had penetrated 14 inches of concrete, leaving a crater the size of a dinner plate. But it never reached the base armor. The standoff distance, the aggregate dispersion, the wire reinforcement, it all worked exactly as Early had calculated on the back of those ammunition boxes. McVeigh completed his traverse, 40 turns. His hands were bleeding from the crank handle. The gun lined up on the 3rd floor window. Miller had already loaded high explosive. The breech slammed shut. The 75mm high explosive round turned the entire 3rd floor into rubble. The German paratrooper, who'd fired the Panzerfaust, disappeared in a cloud of brick dust and timber. But he wasn't alone. 0952 hours. 2nd Panzerfaust, this one from street level. A basement window barely visible beneath collapsed masonry. The German had waited until Thunderbolt's turret was traversed away. Smart. This warhead hit lower, the whole side, directly over the ammunition sponson. The crew's biggest fear. 17 rounds of 75mm ammunition sat in that sponson. If the jet penetrated, they'd have exactly 4 seconds before the propellant cooked off. The concrete was thinner here, only 8 inches. Early had wanted more, but the weight distribution would have collapsed the left bogies entirely. The jet penetrated deeper, through all 8 inches of concrete, through the standoff gap. It reached the base armor, but concrete doesn't fail cleanly. As the jet excavated through, it picked up debris. Aggregate particles traveling at hypersonic speed. These particles disrupted the jet's formation, causing it to tumble and disperse. By the time it reached the Sherman's armor plate, the focused jet had become a dispersed plasma cloud. The base armor heated to 400 degrees Celsius. Paint bubbled and burned. The armor plate bulged inward 3 inches. Spalling fragments ricocheted through the fighting compartment like shrapnel. Miller took a fragment in the shoulder that opened him up to the bone, but the armor held. More importantly, the ammunition didn't cook off. The concrete had absorbed just enough energy to keep the temperature below the propellant's ignition point of 170 degrees Celsius. Abrams was already directing return fire. The bow gunner, blind in his concrete coffin, held down the trigger and swept the street level with 30 caliber rounds. The coaxial machine gun joined in. McVeigh put another high explosive round into the basement window. 95 3 hours. 3rd Panzerfaust. This one from behind. The Germans had let Thunderbolt advance into a kill box. Classic urban ambush tactics. The warhead hit the engine deck where there was no concrete at all. Early hadn't been able to add weight there without making the tank completely nose-heavy. The jet penetrated the engine deck armor easily. It severed fuel lines, destroyed the cooling system, and turned the engine compartment into twisted metal. The Ford GAA engine, all 8 cylinders of it, seized immediately. Thunderbolt was now a 40-ton pillbox, but it was a living pillbox. The engine firewall, designed to protect the crew from exactly this scenario, held. Flames licked through the vents, but the automatic fire suppression system kicked in. Carbon dioxide flooded the engine compartment. In a clean Sherman, this would be the end. No mobility meant death. The crew would bail out and try to run. Most wouldn't make it 10 feet before machine gun fire cut them down. But Thunderbolt's crew didn't run. They couldn't. The concrete over the hatches would take 5 minutes to break through from inside. They were trapped in their steel and concrete coffin. So they fought. McVeigh rotated the turret by hand toward the rear threat. 40 turns. His palms were raw meat now. Miller, bleeding through his jacket, loaded the last armor-piercing round. The bowgunner kept firing until his barrel glowed red and started cooking off rounds without pulling the trigger. The Germans fired 2 more Panzerfausts. One missed entirely, detonating against the cathedral wall. The other hit the concrete on the turret front. By now, Thunderbolt looked like the surface of the moon. Craters, overlapping craters. Concrete hanging off in chunks. Rebar exposed and glowing orange from impact heat. But still fighting. American infantry finally arrived. A full platoon from the 104th. They cleared the buildings room by room while Thunderbolt provided covering fire. The Germans retreated toward the Rhine bridges. The ambush had failed. When the area was secure, it took an hour to break Thunderbolt's crew out. Engineers with sledgehammers and acetylene torches cut through the concrete coffin. When they finally opened the commander's hatch, Colonel Abrams emerged covered in concrete dust, blood from spalling wounds, and deaf in one ear. The first thing he said was, "Bischoff, tell Sergeant Early his concrete works." So, the tank was counted as a total loss. 5 Panzerfaust impacts, engine destroyed, transmission cracked, every piece of optics shattered. The concrete armor looked like it had been through a meteor shower, but all 5 crew members walked away. The after-action report was very specific. Without the concrete armor, the first Panzerfaust would have penetrated the turret and killed the entire crew. The second would have detonated the ammunition. Thunderbolt absorbed 5 hits that would have destroyed 5 clean Shermans. 1 tank crew alive instead of 5 tank crews dead. The report went up the chain of command, from battalion to division, division to corps, corps to army. It landed on Patton's desk on March 2, 1945. What happened next would never make it into the official histories. March 2, 1945, 3rd Army Headquarters, Luxembourg. Patton read the Thunderbolt report twice. His aide, Major Alexander Stiller, said the general didn't speak for 10 minutes. Just sat there, reading the casualty figures. 5 Panzerfaust hits. 0 killed in action. The statistics were impossible to ignore. But Patton never officially rescinded Order 31. The ban on concrete armor stayed on the books until the end of the war, because admitting he was wrong about concrete meant admitting his entire philosophy of mobile warfare was flawed. And Patton would rather lose tanks than lose face. Instead, something else happened. The inspection stopped. Starting March 5th, Patton's headquarters issued new orders about maintenance priorities. Suddenly, every inspection team was needed for bridge assessment. Every engineering officer was required for river crossing operations. Nobody had time to check tanks for unauthorized modifications. The timing was not coincidental. Within a week, 90% of Sherman tanks in the Third Army had some form of improvised armor. The concrete shortage became so acute that engineers couldn't build fortifications. They submitted requisitions for 10,000 bags of Portland cement. It all disappeared into tank armor. The Ordnance Department conducted their own study. They took 6 knocked-out Shermans with concrete armor and analyzed the impact patterns. Their conclusion was classified until 1962. The concrete increased crew survival rates by 47% against shaped charges. Against kinetic rounds from tank guns, it made no difference. But since 68% of Sherman losses came from infantry anti-tank weapons, the net effect was dramatic. The study recommended immediate adoption of spaced armor packages for all medium tanks. The recommendation was filed and ignored. The war would be over before any official modification could be approved, tested, manufactured, and deployed. So the crews kept mixing concrete in German helmets. Sergeant Early became an underground celebrity in the armored divisions. He was never promoted. Officially, he was just a tank mechanic. Unofficially, he ran a training program for crew chiefs. He'd sketch diagrams on ration boxes showing optimal concrete thickness for different threat angles. He calculated that the perfect mixture was 1 part cement, 1.5 parts sand, 2 parts aggregate, and 10% scrap metal by volume. By April 1945, his formula had spread to the 7th Army, the 1st Army, even the British 21st Army Group. Royal Engineers started adding concrete to Churchill tanks. The Russians, who'd been welding bed frames to their T-34s since 1942, thought the Americans had finally figured out what they'd known all along. The cost in mechanical failures was severe. 3rd Army maintenance battalions reported transmission replacement rates 300% above normal. Final drives shattered under the extra weight. Road wheels wore down to bare metal. Fuel consumption increased by 40%. But crews kept adding concrete because a broken transmission could be fixed. Dead men couldn't. The practice reached its peak during the Rhine crossings. Tanks would be ferried across on pontoon bridges that were rated for 35 tons. The concrete-covered Shermans weighed 40 tons. Engineers watched in horror as bridge sections sank 6 inches under each tank. They made it across anyway. Barely. Colonel Abrams received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions in Cologne. The citation mentioned his leadership under fire. It didn't mention the concrete armor. Couldn't. That would mean admitting crews had been violating direct orders. Private Miller lost his left arm from the spalling wound infection. He was evacuated to England, then home to Iowa. He spent the rest of his life telling people that concrete saved his life. Most didn't believe him. The official histories said Sherman tanks were fast and agile. They didn't mention concrete. Corporal McVeigh's hands never fully healed. The scarring from the traverse wheel left his palms looking like melted wax. He couldn't hold a pencil properly for 20 years. But he could hold his kids because he made it home. The driver, whose name appears nowhere in the official records, spent 3 months in an army hospital with perforated eardrums from the first Panzerfaust impact. The pressure wave through the concrete had been focused by his tiny vision slit. He was deaf in his left ear for life. The bowgunner went on to command his own tank in Korea, an M26 Pershing with proper armor. He still added sandbags to it. Old habits. Thunderbolt itself was stripped for parts and left in a vehicle collection point outside Cologne. The concrete was supposed to be removed. It never was. Too much effort for a destroyed tank. Pieces of it were still there in 1947 when the collection point was cleared. Local Germans used the chunks of concrete with embedded shrapnel for road construction. The Third Army's final casualty report, filed May 10, 1945, showed tank crew survival rates improved by 62% in the last 4 months of the war. The report attributed this to Westphalia's improved tactical doctrine and Westphalia's enemy material shortages. It didn't mention concrete. The M26 Pershing arrived in large numbers just as the war ended. Proper armor, 102 millimeters thick, a 90 millimeter gun that could kill tigers. Everything the Sherman should have been from the start. The concrete modifications disappeared overnight. Nobody needed them anymore. But then Korea happened, and suddenly American tankers were facing Russian-supplied RPG-2s, shaped charges just like Panzerfausts. And the crews started looking for sandbags again, and concrete, and anything else that might keep them alive when doctrine failed. The official Army Manual FM 1767, published in 1951, finally acknowledged field-expedient armor. Paragraph 173, subsection C. Local commanders may authorize improvised protection when tactical situations require extended static positions. It only took 7 years, and God knows how many dead crews to admit what Sergeant Early figured out with a German helmet full of concrete. Today, every modern tank uses some form of reactive or composite armor. Layers of different materials designed to disrupt shaped charges. Ceramics, plastics, air gaps, even concrete in some Russian designs. The principle is identical to what those Sherman crews discovered in 1945. Put something between the warhead and your armor. Make the jet waste its energy before it reaches you. The M1 Abrams tank, named after Colonel Abrams, incorporates spaced, composite armor from the factory. No crew modification required, because the lesson was finally learned. Not in a laboratory or a proving ground, but in the streets of Cologne, where 5 Panzerfausts proved that concrete could stop what doctrine couldn't. The last surviving member of Thunderbolt's crew died in 2018. At his funeral, his grandson asked why there was a chunk of concrete in the casket. The funeral director didn't understand either, but it was in the will, very specific. A piece of concrete, 4 inches square, with a rusty piece of rebar sticking out. It was from Thunderbolt, saved for 73 years. Proof that sometimes the system is wrong. That sometimes survival means breaking the rules. That sometimes a construction foreman from Pennsylvania knows more about armor than a 3-star general. Patton never admitted he was wrong about the concrete, but after March 1945, he never scraped another piece off a tank. The closest he came to acknowledging the modification was a comment to war correspondent Ernie Pyle. My tankers are resourceful sons of bitches. They had to be.